What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the second version of the Ship My Money show today. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS, and we are going to walk through the 7-game main slate tonight. Hopefully, the early slate is going well for everyone. I actually haven't been paying attention to it. I don't think it's going very well for me, but I know I had or ended up with a lot of Miami, so I guess that game probably also just started. No idea how it's going, but we have 7 more games. So slates like this, or days like this, rather, I think are pretty fun because if the early slate's not going well, you get to just start over. And this one looks pretty fun. Pitching is questionable in a lot of spots, but there are a couple of good arms on the slate. Definitely some good hitting spots, good matchups, all of that. So should be a pretty fun slate to walk through. Hit the thumbs up button, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. You guys have been great about that so far. Definitely appreciate it. Makes it easy to keep putting these shows out there and keep doing this. So definitely helps out quite a bit. And as a reminder, if you are looking for a specific game, I will be using the banner up here at the top and highlighting which games I'm on, so you can scroll through and find them that way. Other than that, jump in chat if you have questions, and I'll be happy to answer them as I see them. And we're going to start with Arizona taking on the Cincinnati Reds tonight. In Cincinnati, we have Jordan Montgomery going for the Diamondbacks. We have Graham Ashcraft on the mound for the Reds. So not the best pitching matchup here. Montgomery typically is a good pitcher, not necessarily the best strikeout pitcher, but usually good at limiting production. He did miss spring training, though. He hadn't signed with a team. So you are getting a rusty version of Jordan Montgomery. He has struggled with right-handed power so far this season. That is almost definitely going to change as the season goes on. He's not going to be as bad as he has been, but that doesn't mean that's going to happen tonight. It might be a couple starts down the road. So it's an interesting spot there. And then Ashcraft on the other side, not a terrible pitcher, but not a dominant pitcher either. The Diamondbacks are affordable here. They're getting a really nice park upgrade, hitting in Great American Park as their salaries drop. So this is a game that's just going to look better from a hitting standpoint. The pricing on Montgomery and Ashcraft isn't terrible, but it's not like you're getting a ton of value there either. Neither guy is projected for much ownership. Neither one is showing up all that much in the lineups that I built. This really does just look like a game where I expect to be getting much more to the offenses. Arizona 5-man's coming in as a top 5 stack for me. Really weird slate, too, if you look at the 5-man stack exposures over here. I don't know if this holds, but huge gap between like the top teams and everybody else. As far as all stacks go, Arizona, again, showing up in the top 5. Things aren't as split as drastically, rather, when you look at full, different variations of stacks. But either way, Arizona looking like a top 5 stack. Cincinnati coming in a little bit behind them, but still showing up as a decent stack here as well. And when you look at the individual players, it's a lot of Arizona because, as I mentioned, you just have really favorable pricing on this team. Christian Walker actually showing up at the top now at 4,600. He showed up the most of anybody in this game in the lineups that I built. He's projected for 14 to 15% ownership, so the field is there as well. One interesting thing about Graham Ashcraft, it's not that when you see reverse splits, generally, I don't think you should be saying, oh, well, I'm not going to take opposite-handed hitters against this pitcher, but they are nice to see as far as he doesn't dominate same-handed hitters, and that's the case for Ashcraft. Since the start of last season, right-handed hitters, 180 expected ISO against him, 353 expected WOBA. Lefties, by comparison, only a 144 expected ISO and 317 expected WOBA. So again, that's not to say you shouldn't be playing Corbin Carroll or Jock Peterson or Ketel Marte. Those guys all look good as well, especially at these salaries, and with Carroll moving back up to the top of the order. But 4,600 for Christian Walker with the type of power he has from the right side in this park looks really, really good. Same goes for a $3,800 Eugenio Suarez, $3,800 batting 6th. Plenty of power here in a park that he's familiar with, if you want to factor that in. Gabby Moreno at 3,500 certainly has some power as a catcher. Gurriel, not showing up quite as much as these other guys, but still a high upside option in the outfield as well. So Diamondbacks are just looking really good. Really won the whole order because the bottom of the order is cheap, but the top of this order in particular looks really, really good. On the other side for Cincinnati, I think it's more difficult to single out individual plays because, for one, if Jordan Montgomery is just on, then nobody really looks that good for Cincinnati. And if he's not, then everybody looks better than they're projected. So it's kind of difficult to say, oh, this is a good matchup for this individual hitter, because it really depends on what version of Jordan Montgomery you're getting. Now, obviously, Elly De La Cruz is the best Cincinnati play pretty much anytime they play. He has a ton of power, gives you a lot of stolen base upside. This is not the right side of his platoon split. He is a much better hitter from the left side of the plate. But again, tons of power, tons of stolen base upside. Still a very high upside option. We have Santiago Espinal, second base, third base eligible, batting fifth at $3K. That's a pretty nice salary there. And one other guy to highlight, Tyler Stevenson, batting cleanup as a $3,800 catcher. He has been hitting the ball extremely hard this year, barreling one of the higher barrel per plate appearance percentages so far this season. So he's an interesting guy to single out at a pretty weak position. Todd asked about weather in that game. I honestly haven't looked. Generally don't look at that until like 5:30, 6 o'clock. So keep an eye on it. I know the Midwest in general has been having bad weather. I think the Mets Cardinals game got postponed. If not, I know it was in a rain delay. But they've been having storms in general in the Midwest. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Next, we have the O's taking on the Nats in DC. Interesting game here, I think. Kyle Bradish is going for the Orioles. Mitchell Parker going for the Nats. Mitchell Parker's gotten a hell of a price bump because he has been very, very good through his first 4 starts of the season. I don't think that is likely to continue. He doesn't project as an above average starter or anything like that. He has just been very good through his first 4 starts, and that's caused that price tag to come up. So I'm not interested in Parker here, but Kyle Bradish at 8,400 is certainly a viable secondary pitching option. He's making his second start of the season after rehabbing in the minors. He has an elbow injury, but knock on wood, doesn't require Tommy John. So Bradish here at 8,400. It is a tough strikeout matchup. The Nats are a below average strikeout team against right-handed pitching, 19 to 20% strikeout percentage so far this year against righties, 108 WRC plus. So it's not a good matchup, but Bradish is a good pitcher. Struck out 25% of hitters last year, about a 3.5 xFIP. He's good, and the price tag here is reasonable. I expect him not to be limited in the sense that I'd be surprised if Baltimore has a strict pitch count on him or anything like that. He threw 84 pitches in his first start, went 4 2/3 innings. So that's a situation where they didn't necessarily pull him because of the pitch count. They pulled him because he had put guys on base and he was getting close to where they were going to pull him anyway. So I view this as a spot where if he's pitching in the 5th or the 6th inning and happens to get to like 84, 85 pitches, I don't think they're going to just run out of the dugout and take him out of the game. I think that if things are going well, they're going to let him finish that inning. But at the same time, if he were to say finish the 5th inning and have like 82 pitches, I don't know if he gets a 6th inning or not. That's the only spot that I would be kind of concerned. Do they just say, oh, good, you went 5 innings, you got your 80 plus pitches in, now let's go to the bullpen? I don't know exactly how they will handle that, but he is projected for about 20% ownership. He showed up in about 16% of the lineups that I built. I think that looks perfectly fine. This is also a nice game offensively, though, particularly for the Orioles. Pricing here is pretty favorable. And as I mentioned before, Mitchell Parker just doesn't project as that good of a pitcher. He projects for around the 4.5 FIP in most projection models, projects as about a 20% K percentage guy. These Orioles are pretty inexpensive. They have a ton of power in their lineup. Their active roster has a 120 WRC plus and 185 ISO against left-handed pitching since the start of last season. Now, one thing I do think you want to be careful with, Jorge Mateo here, 3K, second base, batting 6th. So good price tag, good lineup spot, projected for 15% ownership, showed up in 14% of the lineups I built. There is a decent chance he ends up getting pinch hit for later in the game. Now, if the Orioles are playing from ahead, they might leave him in for defensive reasons. But if this game is competitive and the Orioles get into the bullpen, there is a good chance that you're getting a left-handed bat off the bench to hit for Mateo, but it is still a good value. It is still a good lineup spot. Ryan Mountcastle looks really good at 4,700. Santander, Henderson, Westberg, these guys all look really good at the top and in the middle of the order. Adley Rutschman, of course, if you can find that salary. If you need a cheap catcher, you can go to James McCann, and I don't think he carries the same sort of pinch hit risk that Jorge Mateo does. because McCann is starting at catcher. So if the Orioles were to pinch hit for him, you have to move Adley Rutschman into catcher. You lose your designated hitter, which means that becomes your pitcher. So McCann's pinch hit risk, I think, is more limited to like if it's the ninth inning, then maybe they pinch hit for him if they're playing from behind or it's tied and they need, a hit or home run or whatever. But I don't think you have the same sort of pinch hit risk in the middle of the game that Mateo potentially carries. So I do think that's something to keep in mind. From the Nat side, obviously a much more difficult matchup with Kyle Bradish than the O's have with Parker. CJ Abrams at this point is in play him whenever you want territory with Bobby Witt and De La Cruz and these shortstops around 6K that just give you a ton of stolen base and home run upside. Not a good matchup again, but it's a really, really good player. Jacob Young leading off at 3,600 is a decent price, but I do think that we have plenty of value elsewhere. So from an offensive standpoint, I would say it's pretty much Baltimore plus CJ Abrams for me. Next, we have the White Sox taking on the Rays in Tampa Bay at Tropicana Field. Chris Flexen going for the White Sox. Aaron Savali on the mound for Tampa Bay. Savali's coming off of a few difficult starts recently, but I'm not overly concerned about it. If you look at his underlying metrics this year, he's been pretty unlucky. His ERA is north of 6. His FIP is around 4.3. His xFIP is below 4. So his ERA is 2 to 2.5 runs higher than his FIP and xFIP. It's likely that he's just run into some bad luck. He has a track record of being a solid pitcher. Strikeouts have still been there with about a 24.5% K percentage this year. So, and you're getting a good spot in a good park against the White Sox. He's projected for about 29% ownership, showed up about 17% of the lineups I built. So I think he's going over owned, but still one of the more likely to succeed pitchers today. I think overall he looks pretty good. I'm not particularly interested in getting to Chris Flexen. Not a good strikeout pitcher, not a pitcher that's particularly good at anything, but Savali does look pretty good. Offensively, I would expect Tampa Bay to be showing up. They're not showing up a ton as far as stacks go, which kind of surprises me, or at least as far as 5-man stacks go. They are showing up more in smaller stacks, which I think makes sense. No Josh Lowe in the lineup today sucks. He's 4,400. I was hoping to be able to play him. But Chris Flexen is interesting in that he's another reverse splits pitcher that, again, he's not very good against anybody, but he does give up more power over the last couple of seasons, or has given up more power, rather, over the last couple of seasons to right-handed hitters. 13% K percentage, 245 expected ISO to righties, 394 expected WOBA. Randy Arozarena, Yandy Diaz, Isaac Paredes. These guys just look like good, high upside, right-handed bats in Tampa Bay's lineup. And then you get a bunch of value mixed in as well. Johnny DeLuca hitting 6th at 3K. Alex Jackson catching at 2,200 if you need to just punt the position and want to include a cheap catcher on a team with a high implied run total. Jose Siri, 3,500 hitting 9th. Obviously not a good lineup spot, but they're cheap. Ahmed Rosario, MPE, second base outfield, 4,500 hitting 5th. Another right-handed bat here against Flexen. So it seems like Tampa probably buys into these reverse splits that I mentioned for Flexen. Not that they have a ton of good left-handed hitters, but they are rolling essentially nothing but righties. Harold Ramirez is hitting 3rd. So really, I think, solid spot to get to the Tampa bats. The White Sox bats are purely your large field tournament stack against a 30% owned pitcher type play. We know this offense isn't very good. They are cheap. Andrew Vaughn is only 2,800. Tommy Pham, 3,900. You can build high upside lineups around them and then just hope that they somehow hit. But there's nothing really to say about the White Sox other than if they happen to do well, 30% of the field just lost their pitcher. And that does have some, it does carry weight in tournaments. Next, we have the Astros taking on the Yankees. This is a difficult game to talk about, I think. I always find games like this the most difficult to talk about because you have two pitchers that are at least competent. Carlos Rodon, we don't know exactly what he is. Obviously, he dealt with a lot of injuries. He used to be one of the best pitchers in baseball. Now he's dealt with a bunch of injuries. We don't really know what he is. His stuff this year, in terms of stuff plus, has still graded out well. His strikeout percentage is lower than normal, lower than I would expect it to be. He has been throwing his slider more recently, so maybe that drives the strikeout percentage up. I know in the start he made against the Orioles, he was almost exclusively fastball slider. And if he is throwing that back foot slider to righties, you're going to see that strikeout percentage increase, but we don't know for sure if that is going to continue. And it's a really tough matchup for him here against the Astros. On the other side, Spencer Arrighetti doesn't project, kind of like Mitchell Parker. He projects to be fine in the major leagues, but he doesn't project to be the level of pitcher that he has been so far in a limited sample since being called up. He has struck out nearly 26% of hitters, 4.1 xFIP. He has walked too many guys at 12%, and now he gets the Yankees in Yankee Stadium. So it's very difficult to point to him and say, oh, this particular hitter matches up well because XYZ reason. But it is easy to say, I want to get to bats in this game with a high total in Yankee Stadium, regardless of which team they're on. Juan Soto obviously is going to be the first guy that I would want to get to from the Yankees just because of how good he is. But Volpe, Judge, Stanton, all these guys in this park against an unproven pitcher who projects to be average-ish are pretty appealing. And then you can see here at the top, the Astros are just really showing up against Carlos Rodon, which doesn't make me feel great because, again, Carlos Rodon isn't that far removed from being one of the best pitchers in baseball, and the stuff has still been pretty good this year. But one thing that he has struggled with consistently, both this season, if you just look at his numbers this year and going back to last season, is right-handed power. 207 expected ISO, 349 expected WOBA against him. Last season, he struggled with lefties too. This season, he's been much better against them. But when you talk about the Astros, Yordan Alvarez and Kyle Tucker are your only real left-handed bats that you're talking about. John Singleton, if he's in the lineup, is really cheap. But Alvarez and Tucker both hit left-handed pitching extremely well, and they're hitting in Yankee Stadium. So I'm certainly not going to look at the Astros and say, oh, well, I like them, but I don't like Alvarez and Tucker. I like them too. But then from the right side, you get Altuve, Bregman, Pena, Diaz, Dubon, if he's in the lineup, 3K, third base outfield. So a nice combination of value as far as, Bregman, Pena, Diaz being very reasonably priced, and just a really high upside lineup in a good hitter's park. The Astros look really good to me, even though Rodon is a solid pitcher. If you wanted to go to Rodon and just hope that maybe he continues throwing that slider a lot, he is only $7,900. He is projected for 13% ownership. He showed up in about 15% of the lineups that I built. So I mentioned it at the top that outside of a couple spots, pitching on this slate isn't great. I do think Rodon is certainly playable, but the Astros look really good as a stack to me just because of the park, hitting environment, all of that. And the Yankees look pretty good as well. Next, we have the Red Sox taking on the Braves. The two pitchers with the highest strikeout percentage on the entire slate. Chris Sale coming in at 9,800 on DraftKings. Nick Pivetta coming in at 8,700. Matchup, of course, is better for Sale. Not that the Red Sox are bad, but they are not the Braves. So far this season, Sale striking out just shy of 30% of the hitters that he's faced. 2.74 xFIP, sub 5% walk percentage. So far, he is pitching like peak Chris Sale, and he is projected for about 40% ownership. He showed up in nearly 40% of the lineups I built. So this isn't even a case for me where I think the most popular pitcher on the slate is going over-owned, even though he looks good. I think the ownership is pretty much correct on Sale here as well. He just really, really stands out as a top pitching option. Pivetta on the other side, pulling 5% ownership, showed up in about 6-7% of the lineups that I built. The case, if you wanted to play Nick Pivetta, is simply that he strikes out a lot of guys, but I don't think you can really get to him here. It's a tough matchup. He's been injured this year. I don't really see it happening. The Braves on the other side, when Pavetta's not striking guys out, he is giving up power, which the Braves always have a ton of upside. That's no different today. It is going to be difficult to 5-man stack them just because they are so expensive, but you can get to them in smaller stacks, a little bit easier. Whatever you can get to from the Braves, I do think looks good. As I mentioned, Pivetta does give up power. You have Acuna at 6,200, Albies, Riley, Olsen. These guys are just all really expensive. So it's tough to get them together, but they make for really good one-offs. They make for really good mini stacks. Connor Wong at 3,500, batting second as a catcher. If you're not going to Chris Sale, that's a pretty solid value option there. Same can be said for Garrett Cooper, 3K. You do have, some cheap bats in the Red Sox lineup, but outside of that, it's kind of like I was saying with the White Sox. The Red Sox are better than the White Sox, but Chris Sale is also better than Aaron Savali. The only actual case I think I can make for getting to the Red Sox is in your largest field tournaments if you're trying to stack against a 40% owned pitcher and just hope that things go south for one reason or another. Now, before I get to the last couple of games, I do want to mention the MLB content that I'm putting out at Dub Club behind the paywall. You can see the banner across the bottom of the screen, 20% off your first month if you use the link in the description below. And what that gets you is access to my Discord, where I'm around to talk DFS, both strategy and slate specific. Game by game notes article that I put out in there. And then also my data that I put out about 30 minutes before lock. It includes my top stacks data, hitter projections, which this is from the early slate. They're not there anymore. Hitter projections, hitter breakdowns by position, by most under-owned, most over-owned, top overall in terms of optimal percentage, pitcher projections, optimal percentage, ownership percentage, all of that. It's $25 a month. You get 20% off using the link below. So I am doing that. It's not as in depth as a lot of bigger sites have, projections wise and sims wise and all of that, but it is more cost efficient. It does give you access to me. I do think it'll make you a better player. It won't make you the best, but it'll make you better. So sign up using the link below if you're interested in that. Now, getting back to today's slate, what I think is maybe the most interesting game, and I am really tired of talking about this team, but the Seattle Mariners taking on the Minnesota Twins tonight in Minnesota. Chris Paddack is going for the Twins. George Kirby is going for the Mariners. Paddack is only $6,500. We've been able to play basically any pitcher that is in the major leagues against the Mariners this season because they strike out so much. And we have 27% ownership projected for Paddack here at this cheap price tag. He showed up in 27% of the lineups that I built. So I completely get the Paddack ownership. I think he is a good play. We don't have a lot of good pitching in general on the slate. We don't have a lot of good value pitching. And the Mariners do lead all of baseball in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. I completely get why Paddack is showing up. I think he's a good play. On the other side, George Kirby, 9K. The Mariners don't strike out as much as the Twins don't strike out as much as the Mariners, but they're middle of the pack in strikeout percentage, and Kirby is just a good pitcher overall. Doesn't walk a lot of guys. 2.6% walk percentage so far this year just allows him to be a bit more pitch efficient. 26.3% K percentage is actually the third highest on this slate behind Sale and Pivetta. 3.12 xFIP. Just a really good pitcher in a good enough spot against the Twins. He's projected for 31% ownership. He showed up in 20% of the lineups I built. So maybe going a little bit over-owned at that price point, but still one of the more likely to succeed pitchers on this slate. The part of this game that I think is interesting and that I've thought was interesting for basically this entire series is that there's a 30% owned pitcher facing a cheap Mariners team that has a lot of power. I fully expect to get to this Seattle team. If you look at the 5-man stacks here, now this isn't even factoring in Chris Paddack's ownership and the path to winning tournaments if Seattle does well. This is just Seattle at their salary showing up in 5-man stacks, the 5th most when I built lineups before this show. In terms of all stacks, showing up the 5th most also. They're going to get pushed up even more by the end of my lineup building process because of the additional power you get from stacking against a popular pitcher. Chris Paddack is getting ownership because Seattle strikes out a lot and because he is cheap. Chris Paddack is not getting ownership because Chris Paddack is good. Chris Paddack this season has only struck out 19% of hitters. 3.92 xFIP is solid. He's allowed 1.4 home runs per 9. There is a chance that Chris Paddack is good. This is somebody that's been hurt frequently for the last 5 years. He had success when he first came up with the Padres, but this is basically an unknown at this point that so far this season has been decent, but certainly not great. And he's facing a Mariners team that has a lot of power, albeit they strike out a lot, but has a lot of power and is really cheap. Julio Rodriguez is the only Seattle bat on on DraftKings that is priced north of 5K. Cal Raleigh, assuming he's back in the lineup tonight, is a high upside power hitting catcher at 3,900. Same goes for Polanco at 3,800. All of Rodriguez, Polanco, Raleigh, Haniger, Raley, and Garver have an expected ISO north of 180 against right-handed pitching since the start of last season. Again, I'm getting tired of talking about this team. I'm getting tired of saying it, but I'm going to keep playing this team at these prices, especially when they're facing a mediocre pitcher that's 30% owned. It's just a really obvious leverage spot in tournaments. I don't think that they'll be unowned, but right now they're projected basically for 5 to 10% ownership. Makes me really, really like them. I'm sure it'll be frustrating again. They scored 10 runs, I think it was last night, but still didn't actually help in tournaments somehow. But I'm going right back to Seattle, or I assume I'm going right back to Seattle. I haven't built lineups yet, but I'd be very surprised if I am not going right back to Seattle. On the other side, you can make the same leverage case for Minnesota against Kirby. The difference is that George Kirby is really, really good, and Chris Paddock probably isn't. You also don't have the same sort of power in the Minnesota lineup, but you do still have power. Correa, Larnach, Kepler, these guys can do damage. They are very reasonably priced. So, in your larger field tournaments, the Twins are fine, but Seattle is the team that just really stands out to me as a very obvious, I'm happy to get to this team against this pitcher, as opposed to, yeah, I understand why I would get to this team, which is how I feel about teams like Minnesota and the White Sox and the Red Sox. And then, so finally wrapping it up with San Francisco at Colorado. The Giants are the only lineup that we are waiting on. Jorge Soler is questionable. He missed yesterday's game. If he's in the lineup, then obviously we're going to want to play him. But we have Peter Lambert taking on Jordan Hicks. Both pitchers are really cheap. I've said it a million times on shows in the past. Anytime you get a starting pitcher at close to 5K, he is technically under-owned. But I don't really see a lot of reason to be wanting to get to Lambert too much here. Getting 2% ownership showed up 8% of the time for me. So, again, if you want to make the case that sort of the inverse case that I was just making for these offenses of the Giants are probably going to be pretty popular. If Lambert goes out there and somehow pitches a good game, you're getting leverage on the field because of negative correlation. That's fine, but very low probability play. The actual interesting pitcher here is Jordan Hicks. He's only 6,800, projected for 16% ownership. He showed up 19% of the time in the lineups that I built. I think he's the very obvious Chris Paddock pivot. Pitching in Coors Field is certainly a red flag. That's never fun. It drives down strikeouts. Batting average on balls in play goes up. All of that is true. Hicks also has only struck out about 19% of hitters or 20% of hitters so far this year, 4.05 xFIP. That strikeout number probably comes up a little bit going forward. But again, you did expect a drop off in strikeout percentage with him going from being a reliever to being a starter this season. But the Rockies are just terrible. This team is really, really, really bad. We were able to go to a cheap Kyle Harrison against them last night. Strikeouts weren't there, but he just limited runs because the Rockies suck. Jordan Hicks, same type of play here. And, he's just getting like 1.5 times less to 2 times less ownership than Paddock. So, like, if you're going to a Mariners stack, for example, you probably don't even need to pay down for Hicks because they're so cheap. But if you did, he's like the perfect replacement in that type of lineup for Chris Paddock, where, like, okay, I'm going to stack against the most popular cheap SP2. I'm going to play the second most popular cheap SP2, and then I'm going to stack against, and then I'm going to load up the rest of my lineup. I think that's a perfectly fine approach. The Giants bats obviously are going to look good here. They're in Coors Field. Coors Field has been disappointing so far this season. It feels like Coors Field has been disappointing for like 3 seasons in a row, but the Giants still are going to look pretty good. 5-man stacks, they're showing up as a top 5 team. All stack variations, they're showing up as a top 3 team. Lambert doesn't miss a lot of bats. He does give up power to both sides of the plate. Since the start of last season, 227 expected ISO to righties, 204 to lefties, 367 xWOBA to lefties, 332 to righties, 21% K percentage to righties compared to 16.5% to lefties. The Giants just look solid, regardless of what their lineup is. Obviously, if Soler is in there, it does give you some more power, but Tyro Estrada is going to look good at 4,100. Lamont Wade looks good at 4K. Those guys are both pulling a good amount of ownership, but I think it's warranted. Chapman is more expensive, but still looks good. Yastrzemski, Conforto, both look good. And then, you can round it out with whoever else is in that lineup, whether it's Lee, Sable, Ahmed, whatever it may be. The Giants just look like an easy 5-man stack to get to, a good 5-man stack. And they're, from an ownership standpoint, it's similar to last night. They are getting ownership, but they're not that popular. They were very similarly rostered to a lot of other teams last night. I think in the aggregate, they actually came in behind the Cubs, which was shocking to me. But I don't think we need to be concerned about Giants ownership as far as running away from them or anything like that. I don't think it's going to be that difficult to make Giants teams that are still different enough to win you tournaments. So I think they look like a really good stack here again against Lambert. Colorado on the other side. All I can really say is Hicks is getting some ownership. They're playing in Coors Field. Maybe they get lucky and remember how to hit baseballs. But I mean, that team is just so bad. It's hard to really be confident in any of it. Ryan McMahon is the first piece that I would want to go to, but he's also priced up. Like Ryan McMahon is more expensive than any hitter on the Giants. So that's another issue with getting to the Rockies that makes it difficult. So I would assume that they're coming in towards the bottom of the pack in 5-man stacks, despite being in Coors Field, because they are not good and because they're pretty expensive. So that's the final game on this slate. Looking at overall plays from a pitching standpoint, it looks like Chris Sale is the top option on the slate. And then you get a mix of a few other guys. Chris Paddock from a value standpoint in a good strikeout matchup. George Kirby, just a really good pitcher. Jordan Hicks in Coors, but facing the Rockies. Aaron Savali facing the White Sox. Look like the top 5 guys here. From a offensive standpoint, Houston, Baltimore, San Francisco, Arizona, Seattle, all teams I like a lot. Tampa Bay, and the Yankees, I'd throw in there as good offenses as well. Again, to reiterate, I guess I can call them contrarian. Seattle would be my favorite contrarian stack on this slate. They aren't projected for much ownership. They come with the added benefit of going up against a popular Chris Paddock. So I really, really, really like Seattle. I'm hoping that their ownership is as low as it's projected to be, because again, every time I look at it, it's just so obvious to me that they're a really good tournament play that I half expect them to end up being popular, but they haven't been, and they've been in similar spots on other slates recently. Home run pick, I did get the model updated. I'm going Christian Walker. I mentioned him in that first game. He's showing up in more lineups than anybody on Arizona. I like the matchup, or I really like the park. I like that Ashcraft gives up some power to righties. Christian Walker's got a ton of power. So I like getting to him here. He is my home run pick today. And that's all I got for this show. Thank you for checking it out. Again, appreciate the likes, subscriptions, all of that. If you are subscribed to my Dub Club, I will be in Discord the rest of the day up until lock. We can talk the slate, we can talk DFS, whatever. And everyone else, good luck on your lineups tonight.